and get started with the class today. I guess maybe my computer needed some coffee or something today. So we've got the exam coming up and your midterm question paper. So with that, definitely get a start on that early so you're not trying to cram in a question paper as well as cram for an exam at the same time. So if you wanted to work on your question paper this weekend, that would probably be a really good idea. All right, so let's jump back into our lecture. And we were talking about neurodivergence and some disabilities. So we finished in this class. Did we get to go all the way through autism spectrum disorders, or did we have to do that really quickly in this class? Because I remember one of the two classes I really breezed through it, but I think it was this class that we did have time to get through everything.
I think we did get through everything. I think we were going to do an activity about like ways that ADD and ADHD people focus better or something.
Yep, perfect. All right, great. So before we do that, let's watch a quick video. I know we talked a lot about neurodivergence last time, but before this video or before this activity, let's watch this little video of someone on the autism spectrum and them talking about their neurodivergence, figuring out how their brain works and how that helped them in their lives and some of the things that they excel at because of that neurodivergence as well. So hopefully this kind of reminds you of things. So when we're talking about these different disabilities, we're talking about things like learning disabilities like dyslexia or ADHD or autism spectrum disorders. So try to call your mind back to what we were talking about last time. Maybe review your notes, and we'll see this example of this person and how they figured out how their brain works and how that helped them. So let's do that before our activity. We won't watch this whole video. It's pretty long, but we'll watch like the first 5 minutes or so. Actually, let's make sure everybody is muted, and then we'll watch.
And I am autistic. My name is Elisabeth Wiklander, and I am autistic. What do you think about when you hear the word autistic? How do you react when you hear the word autism? Would you say that it is a lifelong disorder, an impairment, a disability? This is indeed the way medical language describes it, but autism is so much more than that. No diagnostic manual can truly explain the multifaceted experience of autism. It is a neurological difference with a vast spectrum of representation within its population. It can come with remarkable gifts and skills, as well as devastating traits. But autism doesn't necessarily equal disability. And thankfully, today we have a word that challenges this negative terminology: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity describes how diverse we are as human beings from a neurological perspective. It suggests that the many variations of human brains, like autistic ones, should be accepted as a natural and valuable part of humanity's genetic legacy. DNA shows us that autism is primarily a genetic condition, something that has been passed down through generations and is still widely shared in the general population. These genes can carry something so positive, in spite of the difference they cause, that they have persisted throughout our evolution and still flourish today. Some of our important inventions, pieces of art and music, and discoveries in scientific fields that have moved our world forwards come from autistic minds. With today's exciting new technologies in neuroscience, we have seen that autistic brains differ from the norm. Not only that, but it appears as if each and every one differs in its own unique way. So, autism is rich in expression, but still faces limiting generalizations. Today, I want to talk about the autism that I display, the one that blends with normality and can have catastrophic impacts on people's lives, not necessarily because of the autism itself, but because of the ignorance of it, or the failure to recognize that it is there in the first place, as I eventually would discover. Now, in social situations, we do have expectations upon one another. We use a certain kind of rule book, which, when followed, rewards us with social acceptance. But I always felt that I was different. The trouble was I couldn't explain how, and certainly not why. It felt as if I had been provided a different rule book, and that I lacked a community to fall back upon that could confirm to me that the way I interpreted the world was valid too. So I grew up feeling very misunderstood by pretty much everybody, even within my own family. If I applied what would have been my motives, my intentions upon someone else's behavior, or vice versa, the outcome was often negative and very confusing. So to me, the social world became scary and unpredictable. Now, I did notice, however, especially during my school years here in Sweden, that my mind had been blessed with gifts, like analytical skills, an intense mental focus, high capacity for memorizing information, which made studying very pleasurable and easy. So in my academic pursuit, I came here to Gothenburg, where I studied at the university. I later went to the Netherlands, where I attained my Master of Music. And today, I live in the UK, working as a professional cellist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, touring the world. But this, however, is quite unusual for me, to stand on a stage just talking to you without my instrument. I can't help the feeling that I have forgotten it somewhere. Okay, so one may now think, okay, she plays in this great orchestra. She's obviously done pretty well for herself. What's the problem? Well, I have a very literal mind. And it constantly clashes with both non-verbal and verbal subtleties in social situations. It gives me a very direct line of approach and speech in everyday conversations. I still don't really understand the purpose of small talk, although I can appreciate it now. And jokes and sarcasm fly completely over my head. My mind just takes things in so literally. It loves to analyze everything. My world is a very intense one. My senses are heightened. My brain absorbs everything in through an amplifier. My special interests can completely consume me. And my emotions, they go from the highest of high to the lowest of low, and they're on and off like a light switch. My family, bless them, they can still stand in utter disbelief when I go from a complete nuclear blast to rainbows and butterflies in less than 2 seconds, literally. So, okay, autism influences my thoughts, my imagination, my senses, my emotions, and the way I process information. But without knowing this, it was very difficult to maintain friendships because our social expectations were so different. I could come across as odd, and I experienced a good amount of bullying for it. But the most devastating were the eroding misunderstandings that dominated the relationships with the people closest to me. Body signals, misread. Words, completely misinterpreted. It was so frustrating. It was like fighting a ghost, something that no one could really grasp, not even the counselors we sought for help. So it was a mentally agonizing situation that persisted year after year. And in my mid-20s, I had reached a really dark place. And I started to be truly scared for my future. But then, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. In 2006, I heard about Asperger's syndrome. It is already an outdated term today, but it is still a form of autism on the high-functioning end of the spectrum. 3 years later, when I was 28 years old, I received this diagnosis. And I realized that a good third of my life had been based upon a false perception of myself. Imagine that. No wonder my life had been so confusing. But now I started to see myself in a new, clear context. My whole life and all my experiences just started to make sense. This launched me on an incredible journey of enlightenment and transformation. I had finally been given something that allowed me to explore the relativity of my perception of the world compared to others. I gained access into that mysterious rule book, and I could start comparing it with mine. And so I learned to identify my differences. So in the coming years, I found efficient ways to improve my social skills. I learned to verbalize my needs, recognize my limitations, and develop my strengths. I founded successful strategies to navigate my everyday life and significantly improved all the disabling traits of my diagnosis. But this took a lot of commitment, dedication, and hard work. Because autism is a spectrum, I had to become like a researcher and collect a lot of information from a lot of different sources over a long period of time in order to be able to complete my unique life puzzle. When I thought that I had reached...
All right. So a lot of that is really, really useful, and it's still longer, and there's still a lot of good stuff there. But I think that is enough. She hits on a lot of the main points that I wanted to discuss and that we have been discussing in relation to neurodivergence. Some of the big things there are seeing, one, some of the abilities or skills that were different between how her brain works and other people's brains might work. Studying and memorizing things were really easy. That's something super difficult for me. So that would make it so that she's a lot more suited to doing certain kinds of tasks than I am, or maybe you are. And that idea that figuring out what that neurodivergence is and how to figure it out for yourself, one, with things like counseling, other people who have that neurodivergence, see what kind of techniques and tools they're using, with a therapist trying out and testing out different things. This is what we would do in an intensive one-on-one interaction and situation with young kids working on dyslexia or ADHD or autism. So trying to help them figure out tools. In many cases, a lot of therapists, a lot of parents might be trying to get their behaviors to look more neurotypical, but a really good thing is to give them skills to use their skills, use the way that their brains are different in ways that are advantageous to those individuals. So there's a lot more work going into that now, and it does take, like she said, research and trying to figure out what works specifically for you as an individual. So those are some of the main points that I wanted to cover with that video. This other one is really good as well. Obviously, it's from someone with ADHD. And then there's a couple other example videos I have here. Greta Thunberg talking about her Asperger's as a strength. This is a really good talk. I've heard Dave Rendall talk a couple times about differences being strengths. So that is it's not specifically about neurodivergence, but it's related to it. So hopefully with this, and looking over your notes, you can remember some of these different things. So we talked about dyslexia, dysgraphia, we talked about dyscalculia, ADHD, the autism spectrum. So thinking about those, we're going to jump into small groups. With your group, the first thing you'll do, essentially, you'll get in your small groups, you'll choose which one of these different disabilities or aspects of neurodivergence that you want to cover. So if you're in a group of 2, that's probably pretty easy. If you're in a group of 5, that might be a little more difficult to, if you all have different ideas. And then what you'll do is very quickly go and use Google Scholar or just any kind of search engine and look for any kind of stories of people using their neurodivergence. So anybody who talks about their dyslexia being a benefit to them in whatever field they are in. I know there's specific CEOs, for example, who talk about how their dyslexia has allowed them to think in different ways and succeed in different areas in business because of it, as one example. So going to the APA website, searching there, or just for news stories of people with certain neurodivergences, and do a quick search of some things that they say are benefits to that neurodivergence. So take about 15 minutes to do that, and then come back and maybe chat with your group for a few minutes about some of the benefits of those things. And then we'll come back as a big group and talk about it in general. So we'll jump into those small groups. As a reminder, I'll show you how to do that again. So you'll click over here on Teams, and you'll jump into whichever group is corresponding to your last name. Again, if there's only like 2 of you in that group today because the other members are gone, feel free to jump into another group. But a group of 3 is probably sufficient. So jump into one of these, and then you will quickly, just together, pick which neurodivergence you want to talk about, and then go and do some research basically on your own. And you can be chatting as you do it, say, oh, I found this person, here's this link. Then everybody could read that, or everybody could find their own things, and then come back together. So figure out what you want to do. Hopefully you figured it out by about 8:55, and then go out and find some information. By about 9 or 9:02, hopefully you're done with finding some information, and then come back and talk about it. Then hopefully by like 9:05 or 9:07, we can come back as a big group. So get to it. Also, any questions about that? Hopefully I was clear enough in my instructions. All right, if there's no questions, go to it. Hopefully you can pick an aspect to focus on. So this is kind of like a really quick mini question paper in some ways. So go have at it.
Okay.
All right, so did my jumping back and forth through meetings ruin my microphone again, or is everything all right microphone-wise?
I can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. All right, well, it looks like students are starting to arrive back into this room. So it looks like we've got 2 groups that are still finishing up and 2 groups that are here. So as they jump back into this group, let's talk about what you found. So did anybody find a really interesting example of someone who's neurodivergent and saw that as a really big benefit to them in their life? Or any interesting things that they found about some of the benefits of any of these neurodivergences?
I can say something. I was reading about autism while I was waiting for someone to get into my group, and I found out that Susan Boyle was autistic. Well, she is, and that's why she barely left her house and was taking care of her mother for a long time, and it took her like a long time to actually do something for herself, and now she's famous. And there was a lot other singers that had the same problem too.
Interesting. Did any of that talk about specific aspects of how their brain works on what might lead them to have that talent?
I didn't find it. There was just like one story from like a girl named Temple that she had autism and she used her talent to create things to help people with the same problem. Like she created like the hug machine that helps the autistic calm down, but nothing more than that.
Interesting. Great. Really good examples too. I do wonder if the sensitivity to sensory information makes it easier to, especially in music, to hear notes and pitch and changes in tempos and things like that, and makes it easier to be able to match up with those. So, but yeah, I know it was a short period of time, so you can't do an exhaustive search on any of these topics in just that little bit of time, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I had a
interesting.
friend that we didn't know he was autistic. He told us later on, and he could play any instrument and he would listen to like a music and he just start playing. So I think that was his talent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's obviously something that someone who's neurotypical can develop or have that talent as well. But yeah, I wonder if the difference in the brain does make that just a little bit easier for someone who has that kind of brain. Great, thank you. Any other examples for autism that anybody found that they would like to share? Anywhere on the spectrum of autism, actually. All right, anybody look into dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia? Feel free to type it in the chat as well if you don't want to take over the mic. All right, did anybody find anything interesting on ADHD?
No, I can
Go
talk.
for it. Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
I was reading about ADHD too after I got into the other group, and I saw the story about like a songwriter. I think I've closed the site, but so I could tell her name. But she suffered most of her life not knowing what she had, and she's a famous songwriter, and she ended up marrying a psychologist, and he told her that she should go to the clinic and get checked. So she just found out she had ADHD when she was 56, and she's now 58. So her husband up like having cancer, passing away, and she wrote like a famous song about him. And then a friend of hers invited her to go to India, and she practiced some meditation there, and then she found out that that helped her a lot. So she started practicing more and more. And now she says that she's barely taking any medication and she can focus more, and she's having like a better way of life.
Yeah, really good example. We talked about just briefly that meditation can really help people with ADHD to be able to hold on to focus on one thing and to let the other kind of distracting things come in to kind of let them be. So it's good mental and cognitive training, not just for people with ADHD, but it is really effective for them for sure. Great. Well, what did you feel like about the time limit that you had here? Did you feel like you had just barely found something that might be interesting, or there just wasn't enough time to find anything really useful or interesting? So let me know what you thought about this activity specifically. Go for it. So I see Quinn, your hand is up.
Yeah, sorry, my thing was taking a second to unmute. I thought it was a little short. I like couldn't find anything that felt very academic. There was like a lot of articles, either the ADHD group, and there was a lot of articles that were like, oh, ADHD makes you more intuitive, makes you more, a lot of like ideas, but that didn't necessarily have research to go with them. But I think with more time, it would have been maybe more fruitful. I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of feedback that I want. And you're right. There is a lot of BS out there around these things. So I do wonder if maybe the quick searches lead to more of those kinds of results rather than the academic material. So this is actually the first time I've done this in a group activity in this kind of setting. Usually it's like a suggested question paper, but I wondered if we could do this as a small group activity, but it doesn't seem like it was enough time. Any comments from anybody else about the logistics of it? Also, yeah, anybody who has comments.
I think if we had time less class to explain more about the activity, we would have more time to figure out into the next class, which was today, to go more deep into it.
So maybe explain it at the end of one class and then maybe have you find information in between the class periods and then come back as a group when you meet back. Something like that might work better.
I think so. At least we have more time to read about it.
All right. Okay, great. Yeah, I know that can also have its own challenges too, because if you're working the entire time in between the two class periods, you might not be able to find anything, but maybe another group member would. So thank you for the feedback on this. It's very helpful, especially when I try to do something new in a class that I hadn't done before to get that kind of feedback. So I really appreciate it. And thank you for trying it, even if you weren't able to find a ton of academic information. Hopefully you found some interesting stories that maybe made you think about it. Because that's one of the main things I want you to think about with these things that are still classified as disabilities, is to realize that a lot of people have more differences than you maybe have realized. So I think there's a lot of focus to try and be inclusive to different groups and different people. And that's another aspect that we should also consider, is the way people think differently and how their brains literally are working a little bit differently, and being inclusive to that as well can be really beneficial to society in general. So hopefully it gives you some things to think about there. And we will talk about some other cognitive changes in middle and late childhood. We'll keep continuing on. So Piaget, this fits in his stage of concrete operational reasoning. So here we have reasoning about concrete things. So things that we can see, things that we can manipulate. So you see here the glasses. So at this time, we saw with the earlier stage of cognitive development, they couldn't really comprehend that when you pour the glass into a different size glass, both of them still had the same amount of water. At this point in time, being able to manipulate and see that kind of concrete thing happen, Piaget observed that cognitively we can comprehend that material. So with this, still with Piaget, a lot of these things that Piaget described are seen earlier than this too. But these aspects of being able to think a little abstractly as well are starting to occur. So that mental reversal of things that have happened. So, oh, I see you poured that into the other glass. I can mentally reverse that in my mind and remember, oh, it's actually the same exact amount of water. So with that, the stage-like nature of Piaget's discussions, we've realized since then it's not so stage-like. You don't go step 1, step 2, step 3. Some people will go step 3, then step 1, then step 2. And it also depends on the methods you're using to assess it. And it's very individual for the children themselves. So useful observations. Now, like I've mentioned before, most cognitive research looks at specific cognitive processes rather than like an overarching stage theory or like steps in your cognitive development. So we've talked about memory and we've mentioned working memory quite a few times. Today we have the slides for it. We have a little bit more focus on working memory. So hopefully a lot of this is already a little bit of a review for you, but the working memory is very much your mental workbench, the area within your mind that you're kind of conscious of at this moment, that your sensations and perceptions are coming in. You're trying to interpret those. So you get your sense and you try to perceive what that was. So you saw something out of the corner of your eye, you go and you maybe look at it and you can see it better, and then you've got to perceive, what is that? Is that a cougar? Is that a puppy? Is that a child? Something like that. So where you are essentially living or conscious of, we call that, and what you're doing consciously, your working memory, because it's working, it's calling up memories, you're creating memories. So it's not a one-to-one comparison with what most people talk about as consciousness, but as you're having a conscious experience, your working memory is working. That's probably a clearer way to say that. So here we're making decisions, comprehending language, manipulating information. So let's watch this little video. I'll probably speed it up a little bit. If that's too fast, just put in the comments in the chat that it's a little too fast for you. The person's talking a little slowly in the video to be really clear, which I think is good, but also for the time period the time we have in class. I do wish I had sped up the previous video too. So let's watch this. A lot of good examples of what working memory does, what it's capable of, and also how to build it, how to get a better working memory, because it's one of those cognitive skills that is plastic, that at any point in your life you can do better with. And children are getting a lot better in middle and late childhood with their working memory, which is one of the reasons we focus on it at this point in the class.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk. And I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay? We're not talking to each other. We're facing forward. We're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, and so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting. And he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pull some of that in as we need it, mixes it, processes it in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie. Or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Right? Now, working memory capacity is our ability to.
So hopefully with that description, you can maybe see, if you've seen Inside Out, and I've used it as an example a couple times, how that kind of mental workbench of the emotions within the brain, how that's a pretty reasonable example of what working memory does. In that movie, they can call up previous memories. They have a current goal of something they want to do. Generally, their goals in that are kind of like bigger or more long-term, but they're getting sensations, perceptions. They can have the emotions do things. So it's very similar. What those characters in Inside Out are doing at any given time is very similar to the processing that's happening in your actual working memory.
Leverage that. Our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride. You up for that?
So do try this like at your own desk or wherever you are. Try some of these activities, and we'll see how everybody does with their working memory.
Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words, and I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down. Just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you're wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards. You should have started with Z. All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words?
So if anyone thinks that they have all 5 words still in their mind, put them in the correct order in the meeting chat. Just really quickly type those out. I think I have a little advantage here because I've done this basically every time I teach this class. All right, it looks like Abigail's putting it one at a time, but it looks like those are correct. Yep, and then there's, yeah, people have got almost all of them who have commented here. So, and that's all right. If you do not, that is fine. If you've got 4 or if you've got 3, we're going to learn about that right now. But I'm always impressed when so many students can actually hold on to all 5 of those things as they're doing those other tasks. So that's your working memory working. So you've got to do these new tasks while your working memory is still able to hold on to that information. So different things will make it make these words stick in your mind better. So one way I remember it, I use mnemonic. Basically, I visualize as well. So essentially, as I hear the words, I visualize them and then I put them together in a little story. So tree and highway, I'm driving down the highway. There's a tree on the side of the road. I look in my mirror, and in the mirror, I can see Saturn. And then I see an electrode around Saturn, kind of like a moon or a ring or something like that. around Saturn. So that is one way that I hold on to those in a smaller chunk of information. So you might have used a similar or a different technique or skill. Mnemonics are things that you can learn and develop and change. So we'll talk a little bit about mnemonics here too. But yeah, that's really good. A lot of people did remember all 5 or 4 of the 5.
Okay, typically we end up with about less than half, right? Which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down to 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Okay? And it's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome. Okay? Working memory.
So when he says size of a pea, he means like in your neurological structures, some of the primary components of working memory are about that size. That's about the size of all the cells together. Obviously, it uses the rest of the processes of your brain as well. But some of the critical, like filtering components there in the very middle of your brain are small. So it's pretty impressive.
Allows us to investigate our current experience as we move forward. That allows us to make sense of the world around us. Okay? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that. So I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Okay? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. It used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving, all right? Now, we can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it.
So this is one area where we've talked about short-term memory. Short-term memory and the capacity of short-term memory has kind of just been reabsorbed with a better theory and idea and descriptive model of working memory. So we don't really talk about short-term memory in the field now. It's kind of a part of what working memory can do. So that's one example of theories that are changed over time because of new and better data. It's kind of that idea of our short-term memory has been absorbed by the better, newer idea of working memory.
When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? Okay. You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay. Right? Have you ever forgotten your keys? You ever forgotten your car? You ever forgotten your kids? Okay. Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? Right? So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say, okay? All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about a couple of strategies here. And these will be really important because you are now in a information target-rich environment for the next several days. Right? Now, the first part of this is that we need to think about and we need to process our existence, our life, immediately and repeatedly. We need to process what's going on the moment it happens, not 10 minutes later, not a week later, at the moment. So we need to think about, well, do I agree with him? Right? What's missing? What would I like to know? Do I agree with the assumptions? How can I apply this in my life? It's a way of processing what's going on so that we can use it later. Now, we also need to repeat it. We need to practice. So we need to think about it here. In between, we want to talk to people about it. You're going to write it down. When you get home, pull out those notes and think about them and end up practicing over time. Practice, for some reason, became a very negative thing. It's very positive. The next thing is we need to think elaboratively and we need to think illustratively. Oftentimes, we think that we have to relate new knowledge to prior knowledge. What we want to do is spin that around. We want to take all of our existence and wrap it around that new knowledge and make all of these connections, and it becomes more meaningful. We also want to use imagery. We are built for images. We need to take advantage of that. Think about things in images. Write things down that way. If you read a book, pull things up. I just got through reading The Great Gatsby, and I have a perfect idea of what he looks like in my head. So my own version. The last one is organization and support. We are meaning-making machines. It's what we do. We try to make meaning out of everything that happens to us. Organization helps. So we need to structure what we're doing in ways that make sense. If we are providing knowledge and experience, we need to structure that. And the last one is support. We all start as novices. Everything we do is an approximation of sophistication. We should expect it to change over time. We have to support that. The support may come in asking people questions, giving them a sheet of paper that has an organizational chart on it or has some guiding images, but we need to support it. Now, the final piece of this, the take-home message from a working memory capacity standpoint is this. What we process, we learn. If we're not processing life, we're not living it. Live life. Thank you.
So I really like this one. It's really focused on working memory. It's really relevant in its examples. I think this person did a really, really great talk with working memory in that kind of context, because a lot of these people have probably never heard about it at all, as opposed to you students who have heard about it a couple times from me at this point and then read about it in your book. So hopefully from those examples and from specifically those strategies, you're able to pick up a couple things that you can do in studying and in general day-to-day life that can improve your working memory. So if you're studying, and I mentioned, read your notes again from chapter 1 before the final exam. I'm trying to get it to engage your working memory, make more connections. You'll bring all your knowledge and wrap it around itself. When I talk about using personal examples in writing your own notes, it's the same thing, trying to use and engage your working memory to wrap around this new concept with the things that you already know to make it connect to everything in your life. Using imagery, I used the example that I used to remember those 5 words. So working memory is a big part of our existence and our lives. And also, one thing that I was thinking of throughout this video is that people who are neurodivergent, their working memory might have greater capacity in some way, maybe diminished capacity, maybe for ADHD, more easily distracted possibly. So there's more things coming into that. For someone with autism and higher sensory capacity, they're getting stronger signals in for different sensations. So it's relevant to our working memory as well. So that's one connection, for example, that you might make. So questions about working memory or some of these strategies? A lot of these things in the slides we've talked about here or before, so I'm going to kind of jump forward. So some of those strategies, elaboration, feel free to raise your hand with questions or type them in the meeting chat. So the elaboration, that's thinking of examples, building on that info. Imagery, visuals, so visualizing that information. One thing I do myself is this is one reason handwritten notes have been shown to be better than a computer written notes in like trying to recall information, is because on a computer, if you change the font, if you change the size, if you change things like that, the words themselves can shift around on a page. So you might have typed it, and when you typed it, it was in like the upper left corner of your screen, but maybe when you're reading it later on, it's in, say, the bottom right corner, for example. When you write in a notebook, so, well, I don't have to show a notebook. You should probably know. You've written it at a specific place. It's around other things visually on that page. So one thing I do sometimes to visualize information is I remember literally what the words look like. I often use different colors for like circling or highlighting, or for different topics. I might use, say, like blue or red in my notes. And so I can see those other colors around it, and that's a way to do mental imagery to remember those things. And then another big thing is understanding the material rather than trying to memorize it. Memorizing can be really useful for specific facts. If you've got a test coming up where you need to memorize all the bones in the human body or something like that, memorizing is probably really useful. But over time, hopefully that person training to probably be a doctor is internalizing that information, is understanding it, understanding how this bone is connected to this bone and this muscle and these tendons and these other aspects of the body around there. So that's what we need to do, is understanding the material. So this is another reason asking questions, doing activities, reviewing notes, seeing those connections in life is really important. So, yeah, hopefully that gives you a lot of information about working memory. The word working memory just left my working memory. That happens. So this is related to expertise. And so it might seem strange to talk about expertise when we're in the middle and late childhood times, but at this time, a child can become an expert. We don't usually think about a child becoming an expert in anything, and not every child is going to be becoming an expert in something, but they're gaining that capacity. So this is extensive knowledge in a specific content area. People who have expertise know in that specific kind of content area how to organize information, how to ignore unimportant information, and how to interpret information. So because their working memory is essentially working within that area of expertise. So I've got some areas of expertise in positive developmental psychology, specifically with moral development and prosocial behavior. So a lot of what I hear in the world, just generally in the news, for example, will go through kind of that filter because that's an expertise I have. If someone has an expertise in music, a lot of what they experience in life will be passed through their own expertise filter within their working memory. So with that, when you have expertise in an area, it makes it easier to solve problems. You have more connections to that information. You can reason better about that topic. There's more content in your memory about that topic you can pull back on. Remembering, for me, it's remembering that obscure paper I read that one time in a class that is really relevant now, and then I can go and generally look it up. So with that, the closer to late childhood you are, the more likely you are to have expertise. And so that's about the developmental time period where you can develop this kind of extensive knowledge of a content area. You might have a nephew or a child or someone in your life that really, really likes dinosaurs and knows everything about dinosaurs. They literally might be becoming an expert in that specific area. So this is one reason to support and try to encourage the things that children like as well, so that maybe it's something that they can become experts in. A lot of times, I think developmentally and in society as well, children are not seen for the capacities that they actually do have. So hopefully this might even make you go, oh, I had no idea children had those kind of capacities. So it's pretty neat to see that. And then we'll talk about a lot of the capacities that adolescents have that generally in society we don't give them credit for, I guess would be a good way to say that. So this is also related to creative thinking, and this is the ability to think in novel or unusual ways. Usually when we discuss creativity, oftentimes we're talking about something like art or painting or music or something like that, being creative that way. But you can creatively figure out how to solve a math problem, right? You can creatively figure out how to solve a programming problem that you have. The other day I watched a YouTube video of someone who wanted to make a robot to play pool, and so they had to come up with a lot of really creative solutions to that. They thought about things in different, unusual ways. So you can see this in a lot of different areas and a lot of different fields to be creative. It's not just art. It's really that thinking out of the box and coming up with unique solutions. So with this, for any individual, creativity might appear in some domains and not others. So for any specific person, you might be really creative in solving analytical kind of problems for like math or something like that. Or you might be really good at solving problems in the realm that you're an expert in. Or you might be really good at being creative art-wise. So, but for any individual, they're generally creative in one kind of area, is what we've seen. Obviously, it's possible to be creative in more, but on average, most people are creative in one specific domain. All right, so let's talk about intelligence. I don't know that we have enough time to watch this video. I checked on it last time before last class. Because there are a lot of good points there in the video. maybe watch it after class, but with the time that we have, I'll hit on some of the main points. IQ tests have been used for a long time in the field of psychology. It was of a lot of interest to figure out how intelligent people were, or what is intelligence as well. Some of the problems with initial IQ tests were some of the problems the field of psychology had as well. So it focused on samples of middle-class white males in college. So that's a pretty specific group of people. So middle-class white males in college specifically. So that is not really super generalizable to other ethnicities, other socioeconomic statuses, other countries. And so as IQ tests started to be used in more diverse groups, we thought, oh, well, maybe it's not that these people have lower IQ than these pretty highly educated middle-class people. Maybe it's that we're measuring something about just these middle-class white people, basically. So that is one problem with the historical IQ test. The theories around IQ have gotten better, seeing IQ as multiple components rather than one intelligent quotient, rather than one specific number. So IQ tests today that you do would be more related to things like problem solving, using your cognitive capacities. But let's talk about some of the different forms of intelligence that we understand now. So Sternberg's triarchic theory was one of the first to talk about intelligence as multiple dimensions or multiple components. So we might have analytical intelligence, so ability to analyze, judge, evaluate, compare, and contrast. And so you can see that might be very different than your general perception of intelligence. But also creative intelligence, which is, you might imagine, a little problematic. We just talked about the research on creativity shows that people tend to be creative in a single domain. So Sternberg's work was really useful in showing that there are multiple intelligences, but creative intelligence, you might have a lot of creative intelligence in one domain, but not another. So then practical intelligence, you could call this common sense, the ability to use and apply and implement ideas. So we also have Gardner's 8 frames of mind. So this is another view of intelligence, that we might have verbal intelligence, mathematical, spatial, bodily or kinesthetic, and musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist intelligence. So this is closer to where the field is now in looking at intelligence, that there's so many different dimensions that make up your intelligence. And so someone might be really, really skilled in maybe verbal intelligence. Someone might be really skilled in intrapersonal intelligence, or someone might be pretty highly skilled in all of them or certain aspects of some of them. So an example might be, I don't think we go into detail here what each of these are. So let's talk about them just really briefly. Verbal, speaking, reading, understanding languages, mathematical, math, doing analytical computation, things like that. Spatial intelligence, so someone who's good with spatial intelligence would probably do pretty well in building a new kind of Lego structure from their own mind, do really well in, say, Tetris or something like that. Bodily kinesthetic, you could probably see that in a high-level gymnast, a high-level parkour athlete, a high-level dancer, someone that's using their body, understands where their body is in space at any given time and is able to creatively use that as well. Musical intelligence, it's pretty self-explanatory. And then I always mix up interpersonal and intrapersonal. So like a good understanding of yourself or a good understanding of other people and groups. So I always get them mixed up, which one's inter and which one's intra. I'm pretty sure it's intrapersonal is about yourself and interpersonal, because I think it's opposite of what I generally think of, but that's okay. Your book talks about it. And then naturalist is more about, you could say it's in some ways similar to the practical intelligence. So the ways things work within the world, being able to understand patterns of behavior, things like that. So these are all different aspects that might be involved in our intelligence. And if our understanding or our intelligence in one is high, we might have specific skills or abilities related to that. So seeing intelligence rather than just one number of an IQ score is a lot better. It lets us see that people have a lot of different capacities. Some might be really high, some might be low, and there's a whole range of these capacities among every individual person. So heredity has really low correlation with genetics have a low correlation with intelligence. I should probably change the wording right there. So there is a really low correlation to IQ scores and genetics. So that suggests that probably most of intelligence are things like learned and our expertise and what we're interested in learning and doing, things like that. Low SES is a higher risk for a lower IQ. And so this is probably down to the ability or the opportunities around a person. So if they don't have the ability to learn more and build those skills, they're not going to rank as high in, say, their musical ability or musical intelligence as someone who has the opportunity to practice more or get training, things like that. So IQ is rising in general around the world. So if we look at these newer IQ tests, we can see on average people around the world are ranking at higher and higher IQs. Part of that's probably down to better schooling, better opportunities in many places for a lot of people. So intellectually stimulating environments in early childhood are related to higher IQ. Again, the more opportunities you have, the more things you can be involved in and do and find your own niches that you're interested in will build your intelligence in those areas. So group differences. Like I mentioned, early on we saw some big group differences with IQ, and a lot of that was down to the poor testing that was done of intelligence. Even now we see slight differences in ethnic groups on IQ scores. So like I said, a single IQ score is not a great demonstration of things. But I wanted to show this graph because it shows the main thing I want to show from here is all this overlap. So people have a bunch of different kinds of intelligences. People have a lot of different skills and abilities. So with that, there is more overlap than there is differences. So when we say there is some significant, let's look at these. So group other, so other ethnicities that didn't fall under these categories, and then white or Hispanic here, we can look at those differences and you can see, I mean, it's not super like in depth right here. So this is probably 5 or 7 points right there. So what I want you to see from that is that might be statistically significant when you're looking at samples of 2,000 people or more. So you might find a statistically significant difference. But when you look at how these bell curves are overlapping with each other, hopefully you can see there's a lot more overlap than there is difference in between any kinds of groups. So with this, one interesting finding is that a lot of these gaps narrow in college. Interestingly, about 1 year of college equates to about 4 IQ points. So every other year that you are working on your intelligence, your IQ is going up. So, and a lot of these group differences are also probably not only due to poor testing and invalid testing, but also probably from stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is basically the belief that your behavior might conform to a stereotype about a group. So if you know your specific group that you're part of, the ethnic group that you're part of has a stereotype, you might be worried about and more anxious about conforming to that. You might have more stress because you want to not conform to that. You want to show people that that's not how you are or something like that. That gives you more anxiety than if you didn't have to worry about that at all. That's what stereotype threat is. So, yep, good. I was able to maybe go a little too briefly through some of those points, but we got through chapter 7 at the time we were supposed to. So thank you all for being here today. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or email me them as well. We will jump into chapter 8 first thing next time. Hope you have a great day.